Now, if Joe Arpaio is not allowed to arrest illegal immigrants for committing crimes like forgery and identity theft, because that's foreign policy, that's federal immigration policy, then how is it that the government of California is allowed to take money from U.S. citizens and redistribute it to illegal aliens? You can't have it both ways. Either the states aren't allowed to conduct their own immigration policies, or they're not. Hello everyone, we're going to be covering 4 separate topics today. First of all, you've probably heard that California is planning on giving $500 stimulus checks to legal immigrants. What the news media hasn't told you though is that by doing this, these same California officials like Gavin Newsom are complicit in committing felony crimes according to federal law. I'll explain how this is the case and how the Trump administration should respond. Next, I'll be talking about a garbage propaganda article that's been released by the George W. Bush Institute, demanding more globalism and offshoring even more jobs to China as a solution to the coronavirus. The third thing I'm going to talk about is how the neoliberal left, such as CNN or YouTube streamer Destiny, are now spitting on the grave of Ron Woodruff, a former left-wing folk hero who was profiled in the movie Dallas Buyers Club. Finally, I'll give you my thoughts on the recent right-wing protest to reopen the economy. When I was in elementary school, I remember learning that if you defaced a dollar bill, if you tore it, you burned it, you ended up writing on it, any of those things would constitute a federal crime. There was the potential there for you to go to prison for destroying U.S. currency. While rarely prosecuted, this wasn't just mere playground nonsense. It is actually a federal crime to deface U.S. currency. When you earn money, it doesn't just belong to you. You have to remember that this currency was created by the United States government to serve the interest of Americans. So when I heard that the government of California was going to conduct its own stimulus program and give $500 in U.S. currency to illegal immigrants, my first question is, by what authority can they do this? After conducting my own research into this issue, my conclusion is that California has no authority to do something like this. And in fact, the government officials who are proposing and administering this program are likely subject to federal prosecution for theft. Don't believe me? Well, let's take a look at the statute. 18 U.S. Code, Section 641. Public money, property, or records. This is the federal statute criminalizing theft or embezzlement. It reads, whoever embezzles, steals, purloins, or knowingly converts to his use or the use of another, or without authority, sells, conveys, or disposes of any record, voucher, money, or thing of value of the United States or any department or agency thereof, or any property made or being made under contract for the United States or any department or agency thereof, or whoever receives, conceals, or retains the same with intent to convert it to his use or gain, knowing it to have been embezzled, stolen, purloined, or converted, shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 10 years or both. The government of California has no authority to take the U.S. currency of American citizens and then redistribute it to foreign nationals. By doing so, they are stealing, knowingly converting, or conveying U.S. currency belonging to another person to foreign entities, which violates this statute. Not only is California's proposed stimulus program illegal under federal criminal law, it also undermines the very purpose of a liberal government. Now, I myself am not a liberal. I don't buy into the whole state of nature nonsense, which is the undergirding philosophy behind liberal states. However, the United States government, the entire theory of its law and government, is based off liberalism. Given that the United States conducts itself as a liberal state, to understand just how absurd this program is, let's look at some very basic liberal philosophy behind why the government exists. The liberal theory of government is that human beings exist in a state of nature. Every individual person is a foreigner to every other individual person. There's no loyalty, and it's pretty much a free-for-all when it comes to protecting yourselves from being robbed, being raped, having your property stolen. Because things are so chaotic in the state of nature, it's rational for human beings to give up some of their individual liberties to a government that protects them from foreign threats. The relationship between citizen and government, then, is that the citizen pays some of their money through taxation to the government. The government is then obligated to protect the individual rights of its citizens against foreign threats. That is the theory behind liberalism. That is the liberal justification for why a government exists. So when you have a government like California confiscate the resources of its citizens, take their US currency through taxation, and then redistribute it to foreign nationals, the very purpose of why the local government exists is completely undermined. At that point, you're better off not having a government. You might as well leave and go back into the state of nature, because your government isn't protecting you anymore. It's stealing your resources and giving them to foreign entities. Now, what about foreign aid, though, you might ask? Well, it's a valid purpose for a government to want to make alliances with other governments. If the United States wants to fund a United Nations or give aid to developing countries because militarily that's in the best interest of the United States, then that's a valid use of taxpayer resources. In that case, the federal government isn't stealing money from its citizens and redistributing it to foreigners. It's using that money for strategic military purposes. But here's the thing, California doesn't get to conduct its own foreign policy. Only the federal government is entitled to do that. Now back 10, 20 years ago, you had the sheriff from Arizona, Joe Arpaio, would do these worksite raids. He would get probable cause to believe that there were illegal immigrants working at businesses, and then he would apply for a search warrant. The judge would sign off on it, and then his sheriff deputies would raid the employer. They would check all of the paperwork to see if any employees working at the work site had presented forged documents or had presented identity documents that had been stolen in order to get hired. Any of these illegal immigrants having found to have committed forgery or identity theft would be prosecuted by the state of Arizona. Upon convicting them, they would be turned over to ICE custody and deported. All of these left-wing groups like the ACLU threw an absolute fit about this. They kept declaring Joe Arpaio had no right to be involved in immigration law. Joe Arpaio wasn't allowed to have a role in U.S. foreign policy. Only the federal government should be allowed to prosecute illegal immigrants for forgery or identity theft. So the federal courts ordered Joe Arpaio to stop, and then they prosecuted him when he was alleged to have not obeyed that order. Now, if Joe Arpaio is not allowed to arrest illegal immigrants for committing crimes like forgery and identity theft because that's foreign policy, that's federal immigration policy, then how is it that the government of California is allowed to take money from U.S. citizens and redistribute it to illegal aliens? You can't have it both ways. Either the states aren't allowed to conduct their own immigration policies or they're not. But right now, the neoliberal left wants to have it both ways. When state and local governments do things that encourage illegal immigration, that protects illegal immigrants, that helps them, that's allowed. But when state and local governments do things to deter illegal immigration, to help address the problem, well, that's not allowed. So as I've explained, I believe California officials are breaking federal law by proposing this program. Here's how President Trump and Attorney General Barr should deal with this issue. First off, they should impanel a grand jury. Appoint a group of randomly selected citizens to sit on the grand jury and investigate this issue. Once the grand jury is impaneled, they should provide them with a copy of this statute. They should explain to the grand jury that the purpose of their investigation is to determine whether any government officials in California violated this government statute. They should inform the grand jury that under U.S. law, they have subpoena power. Any of these California government officials, they have the power to subpoena all of their financial records. That way the grand jury can determine who is it that is funding these people's political campaigns? Who's donating money to these politicians for the purpose of having them bail out illegal immigrants? Once the grand jury's identified the people that are funding them, then the grand jury can use its subpoena power to then subpoena records of those people. The grand jury should investigate how many of these people donating to these California officials are companies that employ illegal immigrants. To the extent that they uncover the fact that left-wing billionaires are providing money to California officials to do things that constitute crimes under the federal law, then the grand jury should consider the possibility of initiating asset forfeiture lawsuits. Any left-wing billionaire giving millions of dollars to bail out illegal immigrants should be subject to having all of their assets seized by the federal government through asset forfeiture. Those assets then should be distributed to the U.S. taxpayers through a stimulus payment. Anyone who is found to have committed this crime or to have been an accomplice thereof should then be indicted by the grand jury and face criminal prosecution. That is what President Trump should have the Justice Department do if he's serious about cracking down on the problem of illegal immigration. Moving on, we've got this garbage propaganda article that was released by the George W. Bush Institute. Almost every sentence in this article is a complete lie and misdirection. Now, the article itself says that it was written by Matthew Rooney, that the views expressed are the author's own. But I have no doubt that George W. Bush would sign off on every single thing that this article says. And it's all bullshit. The article is called Globalization and Resilience, Responding to the Pandemic. According to the opening paragraph, as COVID-19 spreads and stresses healthcare infrastructure around the world, governments and civil society are racing to slow the pandemic by distancing people from one another. Meanwhile, in the United States and in other developed countries, there is a rising chorus of voices who argue that we must deglobalize, dismantle international supply chains, reduce international trade and travel, and close our borders to the world. Absolutely. And those people who are calling for all of that, they're absolutely right. You know why the United States quickly became the world leader in COVID-19 infections? It's because we're the most globalized country in the entire world. Our borders are wide open. Americans are constantly going back and forth between the US and every single country in the world. We have foreigners constantly coming into the United States, and this is why the pandemic was introduced into our country. If we had countries that were self-sufficient, or even just partially self-sufficient, only traded with a small number of other countries, then we wouldn't have to worry about things like a global pandemic. If we actually had a source of manufacturing in the United States, if we were able to make our own medical products in the time of an emergency, we would actually be well prepared to deal with something like this, but we don't. The article continues, this is a tempting conclusion. It is by now obvious that reducing travel and other forms of contact is key to blunting the immediate impact of the ongoing pandemic. Exactly right. Reducing travel and contact with other countries isn't just a way to blunt the immediate impact. As a long-term solution, it's a way to prevent another pandemic from happening in the future. But anyways, let's go on. The article states, but what was true before coronavirus will still be true afterward. Wealth comes from communication, collaboration, and competition. Security comes from cooperation that limits the scope for conflict. You see, the wealth and benefits that come from globalism, from international markets, is basically worthless. Because the moment something like coronavirus hits, all of that wealth, all of that GDP, it just disappears. The governments then end up bailing out the rich, even though they disproportionately enjoyed all of the wealth and GDP that occurred during the good times of globalism. Meanwhile, the working class gets hosed. What little wealth that they had has quickly disappeared. Let's talk about the real source of strength and security for a country. The real strength and security of a country comes in its people. If a country manages to cultivate virtuous people, then those people can be depended on, even in a crisis. When all of the citizens of a country act virtuously, the cost of policing them is very low. The government in this situation can depend on its citizens to do the right thing. In times of crisis, if the population of a country is virtuous, the federal government can tell people what to do and they'll do the right thing. Therefore, people can be pretty secure that they're going to be okay without having to spend a lot of money on the government to police the actions of every citizen, without having to rely on the government to bail everyone out. You can know that if during some sort of crisis you can't afford rent that month, that your landlord is going to be virtuous and not kick you out onto the curb. You can rest assured that people aren't going to go out and loot stores simply because there are food shortages. The best thing about a country that cultivates virtuous citizens is that virtue cannot be wiped out by an emergency. It doesn't matter if there's a global pandemic or any sort of crisis. If a country views its greatest asset as its virtuous citizens, well, it's going to maintain that asset no matter what happens. If citizens are taught to be virtuous, if they're taught to be brave in the face of any crisis, if they're taught to care about the other people around them, if they're taught to be proud of their country, to be willing to fight for their country, then those people are going to be happy, even if they are having economic problems due to something happening out in the world. But a country like the United States doesn't invest in its citizens as virtuous people. It doesn't look at having good American citizens as an asset. All the American government has cared about for decades upon decades at this point is GDP, is its economy, how much money people are making. And you know what? Money is fleeting. A pandemic hits, all of that GDP just disappears. And then all you're left with is a bunch of greedy, narcissistic people who have no money. Look, money doesn't bring anyone happiness. Money is like a drug. It doesn't matter how much money you have, you always want more of it. It's why seeking money or career advancement in a country like the United States is running on a hedonic treadmill. You'll never be happy. Because even if you get a promotion, even if you make some more money, you're just going to want more of it in order to keep that high going. The second that you're not promoted for a long period of time or you're struggling to make any more money, you're going to be miserable. It makes more sense to care about other things in life than just money. If the George W. Bush's Institute's response to coronavirus is that the first thing we need to do is immediately recreate the globalist capitalist system, then it's tone deaf. It hasn't learned any lessons from this crisis. It hasn't realized that things like GDP and the size of the economy are not what's most important in life. Sure, some people are able to become obscenely wealthy in the global capitalist system, people like the Bush family. But there are far more losers than winners. But most people would be happier living in a lower GDP society that valued things such as virtue rather than making as much money as possible. That's the real lesson that coronavirus teaches us. The article continues. The approach to globalization promoted by the United States over the past 70 years operationalized this insight by freeing markets for goods and services from government interference, opening greater scope for individuals to decide for themselves what to buy and where to travel, and even within tighter limits where to live and work. This flowering of human freedom led to the greatest reduction in poverty and the greatest decline in interstate conflict in human history. Now, this is of course bullshit. In what alternate universe does the author of this article live where he concludes that over the past 70 years, global capitalism has reduced human conflict? The myriad of wars that have been waged by the United States, the so-called leader of the free world, is evidence to the contrary. Remember the Korean War, and then you had the Vietnam War, and then the United States gave money to Osama bin Laden so that he could fight the Soviet Union during the Soviet-Afghan War. And then, of course, you had the Gulf War. And then the U.S. military was involved in wars in the Balkans. And then George W. Bush went and invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. And you know, those wars have become forever wars that we're still fighting today. And in fact, the Afghanistan war is the longest war in U.S. history. You know, the United States was in World War II for like 5 years, and we've been in war with Afghanistan for almost 20 years at this point. The idea that globalism has reduced conflict and warfare is absolute nonsense. Nor has it led to this flowering of human freedom the article describes. What human freedom is being promoted by global capitalism? The freedom to wage cuck for Taco Bell without health insurance, just so you can pay your rents without saving any money? Is that the sort of flowering of human freedom that the George W. Bush Institute is talking about? Because let's be honest, for the average person, that's the sort of freedom offered by global capitalism. If America is just flowering in human freedom, why are the younger generations thousands of dollars in student debt, not able to get married, not having children? Because that doesn't exactly seem like flowering to me. That seems like wasting away and dying. The article continues. The danger of a pandemic did not rise because of globalization. How with a straight face can you say that? I mean, sure, this disease could have struck anywhere. And wherever it struck, that's where it would have stayed if it weren't for globalization. The whole idea behind a pandemic is that human beings are so interconnected in a global capitalist economy that if a disease pops up anywhere in the world, it then soon infects the entire world population. Globalism is 100% at fault for the crisis that we're now in. The article continues. Pandemics have appeared periodically throughout history. Deglobalizing will not protect us from pandemics in the future. On the contrary, we will ultimately come to see that global cooperation is key to responding successfully to pandemics. Okay, let's start with the first proposition. Deglobalizing will not protect us from pandemics in the future. Suppose when this coronavirus first became a thing, the United States said, not only are we banning anyone who's been in China from traveling to the United States, we're also banning people from any country that doesn't entertain the same sort of ban. If the United States had done that, then no one with coronavirus would have been able to enter the United States. Our rate of infection then would be 0. We wouldn't have had to shut down our entire economy. We wouldn't have had to sacrifice our entire GDP. So yeah, deglobalizing can protect us from pandemics in the future. Furthermore, the idea that global cooperation is going to be the key to responding to pandemics is an asinine statement. Does anyone seriously believe that our salvation at this point is going to be communist China, that they're going to be honest with us and that we can trust what they tell us? Does anyone at this point think that the World Health Organization has the best interest of Americans in mind? Just look at what happened when coronavirus started exploding throughout Europe. It was an absolute free-for-all. In a time of crisis, none of these European countries gave a shit about global supply chains or contracts. They seized as much medical equipment as they could possible. Even if those medical supplies were supposed to go to other countries, they ended up getting seized. The idea that global cooperation is going to work in a time of crisis like this is asinine. Global cooperation is going to be the least effective means of dealing with a crisis like coronavirus. The article continues. First, because globalization is the source of the wealth that enables us to ensure the availability of healthcare, temporary lodging, emergency response, quarantine facilities, and all the other myriad tools required. What sort of wealth is this article talking about? You know, all that wealth in stocks and bonds that was just wiped out instantaneously when the stock market crashed because of the coronavirus? That wealth isn't going to do shit to help any of us. If this is true, why is it that the United States, one of the most globalist countries, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, doesn't have enough medical supplies to deal with this crisis? Because it seems to me like all of the wealth brought by globalization just went to a small number of wealthy individuals. And that's evidenced by the fact that the government was never able to have any extra cash set aside in order to buy necessary pandemic supplies. Globalization may be the source of the Bush family's wealth, and their wealth may protect them from the virus. But for the average American, the idea that they can rely on the wealth brought by globalization to protect them in a crisis like this is ridiculous. The article continues. Second, because international cooperation, when properly used, can enable us to see a pandemic emerge, study its causes and its course, and slow its spread and treat its victim. The case of coronavirus is a good example of poor cooperation leading to a more acute crisis. Exactly. International cooperation failed us when it came to the coronavirus. Only a moron would look at the example of the coronavirus and then double down and indicate, well, the solution to this problem would be even more international cooperation. The idea is next time we're going to cooperate more closely with China, listen to more of its lies, allow the World Health Organization to push more Chinese propaganda. Anytime where there is international cooperation, the same thing seems to keep happening again and again, which is China acts dishonestly and takes advantage of Western countries. That's how our trade policies worked for China, and it's how the coronavirus response worked with China. But of course, the George W. Bush Foundation has to cover for all of these people, because the Bush family was notorious for pushing trade policies that disadvantaged Americans, that sent U.S. jobs, wealth, and manufacturing to communist China. So of course the George W. Bush Foundation would go on and shill for the Chinese government, shill for more international cooperation, and try and convince everyone, hey guys, that was actually a really good idea that we sent all those jobs to China. Problem is, we didn't cooperate enough with China. I'm just going to read one more paragraph from this news story because, to be honest, it's so dishonest that it's actually making me angry. But we'll do one more. The article says, third, because the innovation that globalization promotes enables us to produce the vaccines that will inoculate us against the virus. Okay, where's the vaccines? Where is the coronavirus vaccines? If the reason that this author is saying that we need more globalism is because it gets us a vaccine, then my question is, why don't we have a vaccine? We're more globalized than perhaps any country has ever been in the history of the world, and there's no vaccine even on the horizon. This article is terrible. George W. Bush is one of the worst presidents the United States has ever had. This coronavirus controversy shows that people like him and Barack Obama sold our country out to the communist Chinese. We shouldn't immediately try and rebuild global capitalism after the coronavirus crisis. We should instead learn about it and seek to create a society that's not based off narcissism. Moving on to the third thing I wanted to talk about, I recently watched a debate between the YouTuber Destiny and the YouTuber Nuance Bro. I absolutely despise the politics of Destiny. He's absolutely a shill for neoliberalism, but I respect his ability to debate. He usually does a pretty good job. He's usually informed on the issues and is able to make good arguments. There are a lot of times when I watch debates with Destiny where Destiny should lose because he's making the wrong political arguments, but he's still able to win because his opponents are just so poor at debating. This Nuance Bro debate was an exception. Again and again, Destiny had no idea what he was talking about, was not able to back up any of the empirical claims he was making, and he constantly was telling Nuance Bro that they would need to postpone the debate on certain topics because Destiny had no idea what he was talking about. For example, Destiny had no idea what the political differences were between Charlie Kirk and the Groypers, despite the fact that he's a political YouTuber who every day streams videos about politics. Destiny also falsely indicated that there was substantial evidence that exists that Tucker Carlson is a neo-Nazi, but he was unable to provide even one piece of evidence that supported this. Perhaps most egregiously, though, Destiny argued that there was widespread evidence that exists that hydroxychloroquine, the drug that President Trump said could be promising in treating coronavirus, Destiny said that substantial evidence exists that that drug is in fact dangerous. Again, Destiny was unable to provide any of this so-called evidence and offered to postpone the debate with Nuance Bro so that he could supposedly find this information. But it's not just Destiny who's arguing that hydroxychloroquine may be dangerous and that it shouldn't be prescribed to patients suffering from coronavirus. A lot of left-wing media outlets have said the same thing. Because Donald Trump mentioned it, it therefore must be bad. It's amazing how over the last decade or so, the left has gone from being genuinely compassionate towards people to become complete neoliberal authoritarian shills. People like Destiny are now spitting on the grave of Ron Woodruff. Ron Woodruff was someone who, in the past, was considered a left-wing folk hero. Hollywood made a movie about him where he was played by an emaciated Matthew McConaughey. Now, it's been a long time since I saw this movie, but from what I remember in the movie, Ron Woodruff is seduced by a man, and he ends up contracting HIV, which later afflicts him with the disease AIDS. Ron Woodruff is then told that he's likely to die in a matter of weeks, and he's permitted to participate in a clinical trial where he will potentially receive an experimental drug. Ron Woodruff then bribes his experimenter to make sure that he receives the drug and is not put in the control group. After receiving the drug, Woodruff survives much longer than originally anticipated. However, since the clinical trial is over, he's no longer able to receive the experimental drug. So he ends up crossing the border into Mexico where he's able to buy the drug. He starts smuggling quantities of the drug over the US-Mexican border, which he then ends up giving to people who are dying of AIDS. As a result, Ron Woodruff ends up extending his own lifespan and the lifespan of numerous people who would have otherwise died of AIDS substantially, although he does end up eventually succumbing to the disease. Now, I'm not someone who's predisposed to have a positive view of a libertarian who smuggles drugs across the US-Mexican border. But it does appear that Ron Woodruff's actions saved lives, or at least allowed people to live longer and spend more time with their families. But the left of today, people like Destiny or the neoliberal news media, they would view Ron Woodruff as a bad guy. According to these people, it is immoral to give dying people drugs that could potentially save their lives, just because they haven't been through the rigorous clinical trial process. This is a great example of how much more authoritarian the neoliberal left has become. The final thing that I wanted to talk about is I wanted to give you my thoughts on some of these conservative protests. So yesterday, I believe that there were conservative groups that protested in both North Carolina and Wisconsin. These protesters were demanding that the economy reopen. Now, I'm not surprised to see these protests happening. For weeks now, conservative pundits like Ben Shapiro, Bill O'Reilly, Matt Walsh have spent every day spurging out demanding that the economy be reopened. These are the same type of conservative pundits who seem to emphasize libertarian right-wing economics over any other conservative political position. But it's my personal belief that now is not the time to be greedy. Do you really want to open the economy right now, only to have to shut it down in another 2 weeks? Around the time state governors began shutting down the economies, every single state in the entire United States was poised to become like New York City is right now. If the shutdown is ended too early, then the same process that played out in New York City is going to play out everywhere. This will just make people mistrust each other and mistrust their own government. This will just make people mistrust each other and mistrust their own governments more. And having a population of people who are afraid and mistrusting of one another won't bring the economy back to a healthy state. You can reopen all of the restaurants, but if people don't think they'll be safe, they won't go and eat there. This could be even worse for the economy than a total shutdown. Right now, let's say you rent a business space for like a restaurant, or even that you just rent your own apartment. Rent is due. You go to your landlord and say, hey, I can't pay the rent for this month because the economy is shut down. What's the landlord gonna do? They're just gonna have to wait for the economy to reopen and then work out some deal from that point. But if the economy reopens but people are afraid, companies aren't going to be rehiring workers. Restaurants may be able to make a little bit more money now that people can go to the restaurants again, but if they're doing, let's say, 20% of the business, they're still not going to be able to afford rent. Only this time they won't have the excuse of the economy being closed. This would lead people acting in the marketplace to conclude that this was not a temporary setback, that the economy was not put on pause, and instead, in fact, we're dealing with a new reality where people spend substantially less money because they're afraid of contracting the disease, because we don't have a cure yet and it hasn't been eradicated. This could cause the value of businesses, houses, apartment buildings to plummet. Now, I get it that these conservative protesters are pissed off. They had a successful business or a good job and then the government shut everything down. They absolutely have a right to be pissed off. But the protest shouldn't be to reopen the government. The protest should be that the government needs to compensate them for their losses. The stimulus we got from the federal government is a complete joke. What the protesters should be demanding, all of these multinational corporations and private equity funds that have accumulated all of this wealth while at the same time influencing public policy and government through campaign donations that led the federal government to pursue a globalist agenda to offshore all of our manufacturing to China, libertarian-style economic policies that lowered taxes, while at the same time failing to stockpile necessary pandemic supplies. Those multinational corporations and private equity funds should be required to turn over their accumulated wealth in order to compensate all of the working Americans and small business owners who've been impacted by the coronavirus. That's what these protesters should be demanding. Now, a lot of these protesters justify what they're doing under the grounds that they have a constitutional right to freedom of speech and freedom to assembly. According to them, it's unconstitutional for state governors to close their economies. I watched a video that Tim Pool posted yesterday where he literally called police officers scum for arresting these protesters. Look, here's the deal. Yeah, the Declaration talks about the right to pursue happiness. But if someone goes and, while pursuing their own happiness, infects you with the coronavirus, and then you die of coronavirus, well, you don't have the right to do shit. You just died. You people do realize that these individual rights are made up, right? They come from the liberal thought experiment, that people exist in a state of nature, and that the reason that they form a government is to protect rights that they made up for themselves. The whole concept of liberalism is stupid and flawed to begin with. Human beings never existed in a state of nature. From the very origin of our species, we lived in collective groups. But even putting that aside, let's just take liberalism for granted and assume that it makes sense and is a valid form of government. The first duty of the liberal state is to protect people from foreign threats. Because if the citizens of the liberal state die, they don't get to exercise any individual freedom whatsoever. What these people don't seem to understand is that the United States is in war right now. When Donald Trump talks about the invisible enemy, he's not being hyperbolic. The coronavirus disease is a foreign threat that's taking US casualties. Now, all of these people complaining about individual rights, do they believe that these same individual rights would apply during warfare? Do they believe that the US federal government allowed people to gather in groups and protest war during World War II or the Civil War? Do you think during the draft riots that happened during the Civil War that those people's right to freedom of speech and right to assembly was respected by the federal government? Of course not. The military invaded New York City and martial law was declared. During times of emergency or warfare, the government does have the authority to tell you to stay at your house. That's always been the case throughout the history of the United States. So before you let a neoliberal shill like Ben Shapiro convince you that the conservative thing to do right now is to be narcissistic, spurg out, and demand that the economy reopen immediately, maybe you should look at how the United States government has traditionally operated during a time of warfare or crisis. But anyways, that's all I've got for today. Everyone stay safe out there. If you like this video and you're not already subscribed to my YouTube channel, please subscribe.